Patrick, I'm your host today. So glad you're here to join us. We've got a great show for you today. We've got Dr. Obery Hendricks. Dr. Hendricks is one of the foremost commentators on the intersection of religion and political economy in America. He's the most widely read and perhaps the most influential African-American biblical scholar writing today. Cornel West calls him one of the last few grand prophetic intellectuals. And on today's show, Doug Pagitt connected via Zoom to talk about Dr. Hendricks' new book, Christians Against Christianity: How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. Strong language, but in this case, I think it's really warranted. Today's right-wing evangelical Christianity stands as the very antithesis of the message of Jesus Christ. In this book, Dr. Hendricks challenges right-wing evangelicals on the terrain of their own religious claims, exposing the falsehoods, contradictions, and misuses of the Bible that are embedded in their rabid homophobia, their poorly veiled racism and demonizing of immigrants and Muslims, and their ungodly alliance with big business against the interests of American workers. It's a fascinating conversation. Dr. Hendricks is a living legend. I know you're going to enjoy this and get a lot out of this conversation. So let's jump into the interview.
Well, let's start with that. This being a second career for you, Dr. Hendricks. You're a Princeton graduate and then went off and worked on Wall Street, sort of on that pathway that so many people desire to be on.
Yeah, no, actually, I graduated from Rutgers undergrad.
Oh, okay.
No, I
Princeton was your religious education side?
Yeah, I went to Princeton Seminary, then I went to Princeton University in religion department, got a PhD, you know. But I came out of Rutgers. Interesting story. I grew up in Newark and East Orange, but I grew up in the Black cultural nationalist movement in Newark as a teenager, right? We were the guys who wore dashikis and big afros so big you slam the door, catch a hair in it, you know, that kind of thing. And but I sort of honed my social consciousness and gave me a sense of what it meant to be really committed to a cause. I ended up eventually on Wall Street, which is a strange thing, going from a Black nationalist soldier to Wall Street. Because,
I should say.
I in my generation, we were, got to remember that was my parents' generation was the pre-civil rights movement generation. I, spent my youth in it. And at that time, the aspirations of Black folks, many were that their children would grow up to be a credit to the race,
Got it.
And that meant a white collar professional who could really make some contributions to the community. So I'm like, yeah, we talked about me being a lawyer or a doctor growing up, but law school are too many words, and a doctor, man, I'm too squeamish for blood. So, and at that time, Wall Street was like the Wild Wild West, in the mid 70s. So it took me about a year to get hired. It was hard for a Black guy to get hired those days on Wall Street, but that's what I did. I was there for 8 years, and it was very. When I realized how spiritually debilitating it was, I left and eventually ended up in seminary. I was director of economic development for a small municipality first. Ended up in seminary. Then one of my professors, realized I had gifts of scholarship and pressed me to go to apply to Princeton University. I didn't realize that Princeton University was the hardest religion department in the country to get into at that time. If I had known, I wouldn't have applied. But, I went and met John Gager, who became, he and Elaine Payles became my advisors. John Gager had been a freedom rider. At that time,
I didn't know that.
At Parchment Farm. And I'm like, wow, man, maybe I can fit in here. And I had done well academically, and next thing I knew, I was accepted. And I'm the monster they created,
So tell me about this, what it means to have been part of the, what would you call it, the Black nationalist movement? I mean, when I was a child growing up in Minnesota, like in the early 70s, that's a world that I saw on television and in kind of popular culture, and sort of the Black African movement. And it was very inspiring, for some kid living in an apartment complex, outside of Minneapolis.
Mm.
The world seemed pretty small, but my sister lived in New York. And so I knew about it, and saw that. And it created this context of not only sort of a broader and other world, but it felt like to me that there were really taking seriously social issues and asking the question, what kind of a country is this and who gets to decide? Is that how you saw it as, somebody who was part of it, or how did you engage in that world?
Well, we, it was about, questioning and rejecting the status quo, clearly. And, we had a romanticized vision of what liberation would be like. But what was important really was the political and the ethical emphases of that movement. And it focused on political liberation of African Americans, but it wasn't exclusionary. We had allies, in various progressive white groups. So growing up, that was my formative thing. It gave me, it was also very empowering. And I saw folk who had dedicated their lives to the struggle, like Amiri Baraka. Also, Amiri Baraka was my first intellectual influence, really, because one thing they had us do, we read incessantly. We read everything, and we all thought we were poets and intellectuals.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and bad poetry, brother. But but those kinds of sensibilities sort of have stuck with me.
And so you went on and you got degrees and you engaged, and you've been an instructor and a teacher and a visiting professor and kind of making your voice known. And then for some reason, thankfully, you decide to write this book about the state of religion in America, the political, social state. And really, from the title of your book, the subtitle, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith. That's a bold statement. I mean, I was talking with our producer, Dan, before you came on, and we said, yeah, it's a strong statement. And we both agree with it, right? As both people who come from the evangelical tradition. I got into Christianity as a teenager, and the evangelicals were the ones who welcomed me in. And there was a kind of 1980s openness evangelical movement that I just happened to slide into. So I've spent my adult life in and around trying to help that community find better paths forward. So what brought you to decide you're going to turn your intellectual work and your life to this book, Christians Against Christianity, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith?
Yeah, thank you. That's an important question. Well, as a biblical scholar, I was, let me just put it like this. I was so outraged, so chagrined, and so outraged and so saddened by the way right-wing evangelicals so distorted the faith and so misused it and have so weaponized the faith to do the exact opposite that Jesus would have us do, that I felt that I had to do what I could. Also, because I'm a biblical scholar, my perspective is different than theologians, as you know. And so, I have the tools to engage their biblical claims on various subjects and to debunk them. And so I felt the responsibility, to do that. And so, I'd like to say it's a work of passion only, but it's a work of passion and distinct anger and disdain for Donald Trump, this walking, embodiment of the 7 deadly sins and manifest evil. And I don't say that lightly. He and his, court jester evangelicals, I mean, they are everything that the gospel militates against. and so many people are being misled, their lives destroyed, there are people being killed as a result, and all that. That I just, I felt I had to do what I could do to make my contribution in that fight against it.
Your book is well, it's well studied and well documented and well argued. For people that haven't seen the book yet, what's the essence of your argument? The obviously the title is provocative. It's meant to be. Christians against Christianity. You're not advocating in that title that you're a Christian who's against Christianity. You're suggesting that there's Christians whose very way of living and being and expressing themselves seems to be so counter to the Christianity that they confess. But what is the heart of your argument for people that haven't had a chance to read the book yet?
How would I answer? I know I would answer in a couple ways. The heart of my intent, and then what I offer as I believe the heart of the faith is. My intent was to, as I said, to clarify and debunk and demystify and to rescue folk from the kinds of lies and misrepresentations of the faith that are destroying the faith and destroying the body politic, right? Mm-hmm. But also underlying all that is what I wanted, and the purpose of the book is not just to put people down. It's not to put people down. It's against certain kinds of ideas, but the purpose is to try to free people from the overlay of all these lies that stand in the way of us being a more loving and cohesive society. Also, what was very important to me was to try to point to the ethical core of the gospel. That's because folk talk about the gospel a lot of ways, but we don't really talk about what is the core of the gospel, unless folk will say, well, it's John 3:16. Well, no, Jesus did not say that. Jesus said that the most important commandments, love your neighbor. Love your Lord your God, all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? And when we talk about social terms and ethical terms, love your neighbor as yourself, then is the most important commandment, and with all the implications of that implies egalitarian economics, right? You love your neighbor as yourself. You want the same rights, the same freedoms, the same resources, the same access to all the good things of life for your neighbor as you want for yourself, right? That has profound economic, social, and political connotations. He said, that's the first commandment. Then also, what is the mode of judgment that Jesus gives us by which we will be judged by God and by which we should judge ourselves and the actions of others by extension? And that is clear. It's Matthew 25:31-46, right?
Yeah.
That's the paramount mode of judgment.
How you have treated these, you have demonstrated your faith and treated God.
Have you treated, as you've treated the least of these, you have treated me, or as you have not done to the least of these, you have not done to me. What are we supposed to do? Is make sure that each other have decent living condition, that they have the kinds of resources that they need. In other words, we're judged by how we treat others in their time of need, how we look at and try to serve the common good. And you put those two together, that is the core of the gospel, is it not? And it's an ethical focus, not a doctrinal focus, because Jesus said very little, almost nothing about what we should believe. He gave us no new doctrines, but he did spend all this time telling us how we should live and treat one another. And so I wanted to really try to refocus us on that, because I think that is almost like it's a return to the gospel itself, which is what we don't do a lot of. And moreover, it's Paul who many Christians understand Jesus or the gospel through the prism of Paul rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
So I wanted to try to make that clear, try to make that contribution.
It feels like that you as a biblical scholar are just really not going to allow a whole tradition like evangelicalism or right-wing versions of evangelicalism, or I might even say the Trumpist version of the right wing of evangelicalism, which is this little subset, but maybe the most passionate.
Yeah.
As a biblical scholar, you're not going to tolerate those folks saying, well, we do all of this because the Bible commands us, demands us, and leads us to it. You're trying to say, look, you can make your argument about how you want to be and how you want your church or your political life to be, but you don't get a pass on using the Bible as your rationale for that. Do I have that sort of right?
You have that absolutely right. And that's why when I say speak about a core of the gospel, I mean, I'm speaking of it in the sense of a prism through which all other understanding, biblical understanding, should be refracted. So if you want to say, well, I'm going according to the Bible. Well, is this consistent with what Jesus said is the primary commandment in social terms in the world? Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if not, then you have to revisit that or set it aside, because as we know the Bible came through human hands, so there are contradictions there. That's what we don't see, well, a lot in Christendom, but certainly not on the right wing. And by the way, when I specifically talk about right-wing evangelicals and not just evangelicals, because they are very progressive, even left-wing evangelicals. But so the right wing, I never hear them talk about love at all.
Right.
They don't talk about justice unless it's just us, looking out for just us, those who feel, who think like we do, and largely those who look like we do. And that has to be exposed. A lot of people don't know any better. And so we have these folks that say that they're Bible way Christians. Well, take John MacArthur, as I talk about in the book, right? He's a big shot right-wing evangelical, 150 books, I think they said he's written. He's written million-seller books. He's a big deal. This guy doesn't understand diddly, man. I mean, when it comes down to the basis, how can you possibly say that social justice is a heresy? Fighting for justice in society for all God's children is a heresy? They don't, but many people listen to these guys. So, and from our side, we're not working hard enough to try to counter that.
And look, there's what I really appreciate about your book is, because I come from the same sort of vantage point that I feel like your book is coming from, and that is to say, look, for people who believe that the Bible is important in their life, right? It's an authority, or it has a claim on their life. That's an advantage for people who think about the world the way we do, with justice and all. Like, we should use it. So many times, what I think progressive Christian people and other progressives' response is to people who say, well, the biblical command is, this and that, to say, hey, you can't use the Bible, like, just skip it. And when we do that, rather than saying, okay, if you want to use the Bible as a part of your rationale, we can have a great conversation about that. When we just set it aside, we actually seed all of that community who feels like they want the Bible to be still a part of their life and faith. It just turns it over into the hands of these other people. Yeah. Do you feel like there's a need for progressive or justice oriented, or more, maybe we'd call more full gospel kinds of Christian people of faith, to find their own new and fresh relationship with the Bible? Do you think that's an important part of the work that we have to do?
Yeah, it's an important part of the work. And I think the reason I stress ethics, though, is that that's the ground on which we all can stand and find common ground, right? And not just within Christendom, but with other, religious traditions. And so That's really what I try to stress. Because on the left, folk on the left seem skittish about, for obvious reasons, about using the Bible. They don't want to sound like Bible thumpers, and or like folk who aren't really thinking for themselves, and who are just quoting the Bible, and that's and also we're largely, because that attitude on the left, we don't know the Bible as well. Mm-hmm. We're not as familiar and comfortable with it as they are on the right, who live it on all the time. And so, on one hand, I would say that we need to have, if we take the biblical witness seriously, we should spend more time with the Bible. Or even if we want to understand the frame in which right-wingers think and speak, we must also understand the Bible for that reason as well. But more importantly, if we boil it down and look at the ethical underpinnings, which is why I sort of stressed that in the book, and I stressed it in my book, The Politics of Jesus, as well. If we look at those ethical underpinnings, we can share that together, because justice, this notion of justice, from the biblical notion of justice, is the same. That's the notion of justice we use in the Euro West. I mean, throughout, and even in jurisprudence, right? And so I have a dear buddy I grew up with who claims he's an atheist. He's really more of an agnostic, but he's talking about throw the Bible out. The Bible is ridiculous and whatever. I said, yeah, but you believe in justice? Of course I believe in justice. So where do you think your notion of justice comes from? I can show you. It's 8th century prophets, right? And justice pervades, the term pervades the Bible. And so that's what I'm saying. Stand on that ethical ground. We can, and we don't, and that gives us less room for division.
Yeah, that's really well said. And your book, The Politics of Jesus, was powerful for me. It has a great amount of influence, and it really raises this, I think, important question that can be helpful for a lot of people who haven't yet thought about sort of their core understanding of, when we call for justice in our society, we then have to ask ourselves, like, which part of our society is responsible to mitigate that justice, right? And one of the arguments that conservatives make, and that the right wing of the evangelical and charismatic Pentecostal traditions latch onto, is they'll say, absolutely, we should pursue justice. But we shouldn't ask the government to do that. If we're going to care for the least of these, we as the church should do it. This is the big argument, right? I've talked to thousands of leaders, and they've all said the same thing. Yes, we're for justice. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You, as a liberal, you think the government should do it, and us as biblical conservatives think that should be done through other means. And this is a big question in a democratic society of a pluralistic culture like we have. Do you have thoughts on how to help people figure out what should be done through nonprofit religious organizations as justice efforts, and what should be done through the mandates that can come through the government, because government's a particular thing? That feels like it's at the essence of this just first divide that happens between the right wing and the not right wing.
No, I that's a very good point. Well, there are two parts to that. One is that there is this misunderstanding that the Bible says that those who are in positions of governance and influence, that they do not have a responsibility to look out. It's a libertarian Bible, right? You don't have a responsibility to look out for other folk. And that's just not true. When you look throughout the Bible, kings and princes, those who are in positions of governance, and even the wealthy, are told again and again, commanded again and again, that they have a responsibility to work for justice for the poor, to make sure that those who are in need are looked out for. And by the way, when I mention justice, because there's libertarian justice, there's utilitarian justice, we're talking about egalitarian justice. How do we know that? Because Jesus says, Leviticus says, love your neighbor as yourself. That's egalitarian. You want the same things for your neighbors as you want for yourself. that's egalitarian. You apply that to this notion of justice, then it's egalitarian justice. So I just wanted to make that point. So they have this misunderstanding. They don't, in Psalm 72, which we understand as an inauguration psalm for inauguration of a king. It talks about the responsibility of the king to do justice and righteousness for the poor. On the other hand, churches do have a responsibility to try to struggle for a just and healthy and loving world, and that is not just to do charity, but to work against systemic injustice, right? To work to the very least insist upon and inspire those who represent us to work for just policies and institutions. So, I mean, on the right wing is right. Churches have a responsibility. Well, most of them don't even recognize a responsibility, but churches do have a responsibility, but it's not their primary responsibility to be the social safety net of society.
Yeah. Yep.
We're told that it is those who are in power, who have the resources and the power and the backing of the state to do it. And I try to show that in the book, in the numerous times the Bible tells us that.
Yeah, and you really do it well, and I'd commend it to anyone who's wrestling with this idea. You know, in the New Testament, you have this classic story that so many people know of the Good Samaritan, and that Good Samaritan narrative is about somebody who's in a culturally different space, caring for someone who's become vulnerable and takes their own resources and cares for the person. And that one doing the good is a Samaritan. And Jesus makes this big contrast to the Jewish people who look down on the Samaritans, that the one you think is the evildoer is actually the one doing good. It's supposed to create this mental conflict that they've been living in. But this whole question came because Jesus, as you say, is in this teaching moment and says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then people say, but who's my neighbor? Like, to whom am I responsible? And then, so that Good Samaritan narrative is to respond to this question of who is my neighbor. Where I'm going with this is, it kind of reminds me that this is this who is my neighbor is an evergreen question. Like, it comes up with every generation, maybe with each person, time and time again. We shouldn't just feel like, well, we've answered that question long ago. I feel like that's still a piece that the Jesus tradition wants to insert into our human relationships, which is it possible that your obligation goes further to other human beings than you currently think? And that feels like it's the power of that story, as opposed to, I don't know, pay for their wounds and put them in a hotel and get them a doctor and cross cultural boundaries. It's also asking, can you expand your notion? And this has been something that kind of has ebbed and flowed in our society. And it feels like we're back in a moment where a whole lot of religious people feel like their obligation is to a smaller group of humanity than to a larger group of humanity. And for some reason, the right wing of the religious movement, Christian religious movements in America, have just built a wall around where their obligation goes and how far it goes. And so I'm just wondering what about your thoughts on all that?
My thoughts on how far their obligations go. Well, part of the problem is, as you know, that notions of Christian nationalism and exclusionary notions of white supremacy. I mean, mainstream Christianity is shot through with them, right? I mean, historically. So mainstream Christianity has never really, it's never had an expansive vision of the neighbor, has it?
That's right.
I mean, look, they've mistreated everybody, man. I mean, I mean, even in the history of this country, immigrant Irish and Italians weren't considered, white, weren't accepted as by white supremacy, right? And so, it's also part of that libertarian tradition where we don't have any responsibility to anyone but ourselves.
Yeah.
Like the Good Samaritan is a sucker to the libertarians, It's like, and remember, libertarianism says you can take care of people if you want to, but you don't have a responsibility to do that. And so American Christianity has always been tribal, I think. It's always been exclusionary, and it's always been oppositional to a great extent. It's never really been loving, and that's the irony, because so much of early evangelicalism did strive to do that, to work across those boundaries, right? I mean, I'm always reminded that the most important, most slavery abolitionists were evangelicals. The institutional house movement, institutional church movement, right? What's the woman's name? Adams in Chicago, and all those folk who built these institutions to help folk. That's those evangelicals, right? I mean, there were evangelicals who were strong critics of capitalism, and strong supporters of unions. Well, man, forget that now. I mean, Billy Graham said there'd be no snakes or unions in heaven. Like,
Is that right? I didn't know Billy Graham an anti-union guy.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I quote that in the book. Yeah, my chapter on unions. It's sad, man. These guys. I mean, oh boy. Wow. It's just sad.
What was the rationale for that? I'm sorry, I haven't read that part of the book. What was the rationale for evangelicals saying that employees organizing in unions so that they have voice that's equal to their bosses in labor? What would be their rationale for that? Just that anti-communist, anti-socialist movement of the 50s and 60s?
Well, that's the American Liberty League, right, of the 30s, the DuPont brothers, right, got together and to fight against FDR's change of governmental philosophy from laissez-faire, like we don't have a responsibility to, we do have a responsibility to help the least of these. And, they got together, and because that threatened their preeminence and their wealth, they got together to fight it. And and so socialism, or anything like, they use socialism, the fear about the Bolsheviks, they use that against every kind of policy that was to help the people. And unions, were a big threat to them, right? And so, but that just shows that there's this, and the name of that chapter, of course, is the Unholy Alliance between right-wing evangelicals and big business. The right-wing evangelicalism has supported big business hand in glove since the 20s. And unions are villains. They are taking away the freedom of capitalists to be able to do what they want to do and to make a living. And I mean, it's really sad. I mean, the 14th Amendment was even misapplied. The 14th Amendment was supposed to protect the African American who were freed from slavery, and they switched it up that it protected corporations. And they said corporations were persons, which is the most backward thing you can come up with. And even Jimmy Carter recently said, this was the worst Supreme Court judgment ever. But all this to support big business. Mm-hmm. And the sad thing about it is that this militates against the interests of the average evangelical. Can I just share something?
Please do. Yeah, I'd love it.
This is from that chapter to show you just how bad it is. One of the most striking examples of the unholy marriage between right-wing evangelicals and big business is found in the 1990 Christian Coalition Leadership Manual, The manual states that, quote, God establishes pattern for work, unquote, which it explains using 4 Bible passages instructing slaves to be obedient to their masters as a model for modern employer-employee relations, and includes this passage from 1 Peter, slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all due respect, blah, blah, blah. The manual goes on to explain with no sense of irony, quote, of course, slavery was abolished in this country many years ago, so we must apply these principles to the way Americans work today.
Oh my gosh.
To employees, and employers. Then it draws a conclusion that could have been written in feudal times. Quote, Christians have a responsibility to submit to the authority of their employers, since they are designated as part of God's plan for the exercise of authority on earth. So, brother.
Wow. That is a stunning, that's like the tobacco papers being found, like saying, no, they really are saying your boss now has the authority given by God. And if you try to rise up to have better working conditions or pay, you are going against your employer and therefore against the authority of God.
Yes.
That's
yes.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, but it's real. That's what we're fighting against. And of course, Trump, he's the corporate, thief and crook he is, he's all about supporting big business. So and he is their hero. They even call him a Messiah, right? Literally they call him Messiah, right? And talked about one day there'll be a book of Trump in the Bible. So of course that's that's right up his alley, in their alley, to continue to support big business exploitation of workers.
I would imagine, don't jump into your brain back in, early 2000s when you were writing the Politics of Jesus book and doing all your work. Back then, I had a sense, as somebody who comes from the evangelical tradition, that evangelicalism and the kind of fundamentalism and the kind of anti-Roe versus Wade religious movements, I just thought all of that was on the decline. I was saying things 20 years ago that in 20 years, by 2020, you're not going to have a resurgent or powerful evangelical world that sort of exists now. This is on its final stages. It's on its last foot. All of that turns out to be totally wrong. Maybe the opposite has happened. Somehow that group got together and came back with more power. And we used to talk about, the death rattle that a human being experiences in their final stage, sort of a surge of energy. But it's really at the final, it's at the end. Did you think 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that you'd have to write a book like this, that you'd have to recount the power of these ridiculous statements written in 1990? How did you think about it? And just sort of, where's your head and heart on all of this now, thinking, this is 2022 and we're having to deal with, the ramifications of a religious right influenced insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. And
who could have foreseen anything like that? It's like, some of the policies they're espousing would take us back 60 years.
Yeah.
We thought, I never would have dreamed we've seen such resurgence of hatred and racial antipathy anymore, like we'd seen in the past. But clearly it was in the Pandora's box, and all we needed was one dedicated, totally corrupt agent of evil to open that Pandora's box. And that was Trump. And I'm reading a lot of, I don't get into all these silly comparisons of people with Hitler, but I take seriously his ex-wife's one of his wives testimony that Trump had Hitler's Mein Kampf on his side table, and that he paid attention because he is following what he's done and doing, still follows Hitler's Hitler's strategy in the outline of his works. And so Trump has been an agent of evil in the sense that he has very self-consciously opened this Pandora's box of hatred and evil and fascism, just to serve his own evil ends. And so, I mean, that's the way I see it now. I truly believe that if we did not have a Trump in 2015, 2016, that box wouldn't have been open. It might have gotten open in the future, but things would be much better now. I mean, in so many ways, we'd have less people dead from COVID.
Yeah.
The economy would not be would not have gotten so bad if he had just acted like a decent human being. But think about it, brother. I don't get into all this metaphysical, supernatural stuff, but think about this. There's something so evil about this destructive, hateful person. It's almost like, as I write in the epilogue, it's like this spirit of Antichrist. I don't mean the beast from Revelation. That's not Antichrist, but the spirit of Antichrist, the spirit that uses and claims to represent the teachings of Jesus Christ, but uses them for its own evil ends, to do the exact opposite of what Jesus would have us do. It's like we're in this kind of crazy moment where this spirit of Antichrist is starting to permeate, go through the society. I mean, it's hard to understand it any other way. It's scary.
It is scary. I mean, I agree with you. It's caused me to rearrange my entire life and ministry and work and everything I do. I mean, it's bonkers. And I did a podcast with somebody that I met just after Trump was elected, who is another pastor and a Trump supporter. And we called it Untrumped. And for 7 weeks in a row, for an hour live in a Zoom conversation like this, we talked about how he could support Trump and he wanted to know how I couldn't. And mostly, a lot of our great conversation happened when we were broadcasting, but then we'd talk for another hour or so afterward. And that's when I really heard pieces of it. And he would say similar things. He would say, as somebody who's a strong supporter of Trump, he would say, look, I never thought the guy was going to get elected. And the same way you like, how did this happen? And his conclusion was, that shows that it's a work of God. And so many people that I've met over these last 4 years believe that. They're like, it makes no sense. He should have never been the nominee, should have never been elected. This is proof of the claim of God on his life. Like when people say Messiah stuff and all this things that go on now with QAnon, he's going to be back in office. It's because they say he should have never been there in the first place. Like people like us look at it and say, something's really broken here. We've got to figure out how this happened. And they're like, how it happened? It's a miracle. That's how it happened. And it shows God's blessing on all. And they've doubled down. They've doubled down on this idea where now, whether it's anti-vaxxing or whatever, it all kind of gets put in the mix of God is up to something, and all of you shaking your heads, that's because you don't really understand how the Spirit is working in the world. And that's a piece that to me, that just drives me out of my mind. Like, yes, you brother. Cannot give this over to that. I don't know what your thoughts are.
No, I'm brother, I'm with you on that. But the question I would ask him is, well, did God put Hitler in office? Hitler, had been knocked down. I mean, he ends up running the country. I mean, was he ordained by God? It's crazy. And they don't look at how throughout history, Machiavellian folk and folk who have absolutely no integrity at all, how they can and folk who are good con men, how they can do this. He's just a con man liar. Who appealed to the very worst in America, and that got him in. I mean, he appealed to racism about Obama. He lied about how rich he is. His father only loaned him $1 million, and we know that now that his father gave him something like $40 million, which is a whole lot more now than it was then. And, his net worth is less now than it would have been if you just put the money in the savings account, right? It's terrible. It's just terrible. It's just,
it's well documented that, and I've watched the clips that he went to an evangelical college in Iowa, and that's where he, famously said lots of things like, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, and at that meeting, he says to the evangelicals, I said, look, I know you're not my kind of people, and I'm not your kind of person. I know you have lots of reasons to not trust me. Let me tell you this: you vote for me, you will have power.
Yeah.
If I'm in office, I'm taking you with me. And my contention is that evangelical voters, maybe like a lot of people, but especially evangelicals, don't need their politicians to be like them, but they really do want their politicians to like them. And he said, I like you, and I'll take you with me, and you will have power. And this is the deal. Now, in the tradition, the Christian tradition is like, yeah, that's called a temptation. That's like reading the temptation narrative and having Jesus be like, oh, I get all the kingdoms of the world. I'll take that deal. Like it felt to me, as someone who's close to that tradition, and I know he was speaking to people that, just like me, saying, I've got a deal for you. And so many people said, and lots of famous people, you write about them in your book, they said, we'll take that deal because what we really want is political power. And then at the end of it all, they end up with 3 Supreme Court justices, which for a lot of them, that's all they ever wanted. They didn't want a president. They wanted a justice. They wanted 2. Right. They got 3. So while you and I, say the things that we need to rightly say, and boy, these folks are just saying to themselves, worked out. I mean, it in the long run, he's a bad guy. Yeah, he didn't do the right things. Yeah, he led an insurrection. God is using him. But in the end, we got it. And that's a thing also, I think, that the Christian tradition, provides us a response to, right? Like that's called trading your birthright for a bowl of porridge, right? Wow. That's like there's whole narratives about swapping out something of value for something that was sort of worthless. Now they would say, that they got something of great value and a lot of power and all the rest of it. But do you have any thoughts about that? Because I think if we continue to take this group of voters and people and just keep them away from other political imaginations, because we basically say you're charlatan, he's a charlatan and you're a charlatan, and everybody's a problem. Like, I just think that's not going to get us anywhere. So I don't know what your thoughts are on.
No, you're absolutely right. Well, couple. Well, let me speak to that. I think you're right. I spoke earlier, mentioned earlier about being able to speak in their frame. We have to try to bridge the gap. But I think it's important to recognize that Trump appealed to many people because they realized that he hated and disdained the same people that they do. Yep. And so they're not there out of goodwill. And reason is not going to change them. Secondly, many of these folk, because their Christianity, because the shape of their Christianity is determined by how congruent it is with their own interests, these folk are more ideological Christians than Christians of biblical faith. It's whatever serve their interests, they will do, and they don't care. So I cite in the book a poll. I think it's a PRI poll. It's a Pew poll rather, that says, ask folk how much did the Bible have to do with their attitudes with immigrants, toward immigrants. And majority of them said, these right-wing evangelicals said, the Bible has nothing to do with it. They don't care what the Bible says. they're going to mistreat, and treat immigrants however they feel. So these folk, it's not about what the Bible says. It's not about love. It's not about love your neighbor. It's not about community. It's not about the common good. It's about just us, not justice, just us. And it's about what serves our interests. And I think once we realize that, I think that dictates a certain two-pronged approach. One is that the right wing is not coming toward you and me. We're going to have to move toward them. And I think the only way we can do that is to try to talk about the biblical text itself. You know, what does it mean to love our neighbors as so? What's Matthew 25 about? Things like that.
Yeah.
You know, and give them the benefit of the doubt to begin with, that they are sincere. They're just sincerely wrong until they prove themselves to be insincere.
Yeah, we use this passage out of Philippians, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but consider others before yourself. Like if you're a biblical sort of like that works, right? And you know that faith, hope, and love are the three things that are going to remain after all this. And the greatest of these is love.
Yeah.
And but the thing that gets me about it is so many people feel like, well, I think all of us have a tendency to see ourselves as the hero in the story. We're always the good guy or gal in the story, you know? Yeah. And people are like, no, this is the more loving way, you know. Somehow it's when I watch the video of those insurrectionists being in the Senate dais and praying in the Senate dais. I don't know if you've seen that video.
Yeah.
But they're praying in a kind of prayer that, you know, is familiar to people who've been in Christian religious traditions. Like, I know that accent, I know that wording and that phrase. I know exactly where that comes from. That's my tradition. Those people they're praying in my way in there, and I know who they are. And they saw themselves as the good guys. It's just one of these dilemmas that is really hard to get to, right? Where somehow the edict of put others before yourself, they're like, well, that's exactly what I'm doing. And I don't know, it's the part that I guess it's the preacher and all of us that, you know, we watch people at our churches and then they leave and seemingly have no connection between the things we talk about here and the way we live. That kind of frustration that is visited on religious leaders all the time.
I think a lot has to do with the fact that many churches stress an amorphous faith, but more importantly, they stress doctrine and confession. Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? Yes, I have. All right, good. Have a good day. I mean, they don't tie it to ethical behavior at all. And, you know, and to the extent that they talk about morality, it's about personal piety alone and not social morality. You know, it's not just a failure of Christian imagination. It's a failure of Christian appropriation, Christian appropriation of the Bible and taking the Bible as seriously as it should be taken. And it's part of our tradition. Listen, Muslims study the Quran all the time. In the Jewish tradition, study is all the time, right? Right, they go to Hebrew school every Saturday, and these children, I have friends who's a Hebrew Bible scholar, and man, you know, he can read Hebrew so well, it's ridiculous because he's been doing it since a child. What do we have in Christendom? Well, you go to church, you might have a prayer meeting, and you might have Bible study for an hour, but usually it's not that deep, right? And so we rely on the preaching moment much too much for our information, and we don't get much out of it at all. So I mean, there's this deep problem in Christendom that really that really leaves room for all of these transgressions and these distortions and this acting out and mistreatment of human beings.
Your book, remind people, it's called Christians Against Christianity, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying a Nation and a Faith. How has it been received? For what stories have you heard about people who have benefited from the book?
You know, it's interesting. Most of the responses I've gotten have been, I mean, overwhelmingly appreciative and supportive. You know, there have been a couple, you know, I won't even call, well, I mean, I've gotten some hate, you know,
Sure.
email, stuff like that. But the criticisms I've gotten have never been substantive.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's this is a hateful book. Yeah, okay. Tell me how. It doesn't really talk about the Bible. Well, come on, baby. That's, you know, it's all about the Bible. You know, the point is, I don't know that they found a way to combat me yet, because I work very hard to be biblically and based and you know and fully contextualized with the Bible, and to approach it with integrity. And you know, they what it shows me, they don't know enough about the biblical tradition to come at me. But it also means that a lot of them are not, their faith is not well informed. You know, it's formed by the things that, and the prejudices that they hear, and the biases they hear, and some of the stuff they believe in is that's in the Bible isn't even in there.
Yeah, right.
So, you know, it's a failing of the church writ large, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've not done a good job of teaching folk. We've indoctrinated them. Not you and me, hopefully, but
yeah.
but you know, we indoctrinate them doctrinally. You know.
Well, one of the things I appreciate is that, you know, you're inside the religious tradition. It's easy for a lot of us to want to make a distinction between us and the others, right? We can slice that prosciutto pretty thin, right? To sort of, and you're saying, hey, rest of the religious community, including right-wing evangelicals, we need to talk about this. I'm not just going to ignore it and push you off. You know, this is something that those of us who watch radicalization happen in any parts of our society say to any of the other groups that are not part of the radicalizing element, why don't you do something about it in your own community, right? We say this all the time, say it to people in Hollywood and in politics and other religious traditions. You know, you have to take this on yourselves, and that's what you're doing. I know some people might want to say, oh, this is dividing the church, and you're saying these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. I didn't read it that way. I read it as your work as what we need to do is speak up about this thing that we also are a part of, which is the religious subculture in the United States, because it actually has consequence on society. You know, I'm critiqued all the time for people being like, I thought you were like a preacher and like a church planter, and like, what are you doing monkeying around with all of this? It kind of has nothing to do with it. And you're like, well, it became a public health problem, and it became a, you know, like now it's, you're compelled, like finding that person on the side of the road. It's a Samaritan experience, a good Samaritan experience. And so I just thank you so much for the work you're doing and being willing to put in the work to say, this is the alternative that can exist. If you care about a biblical understanding of your faith, here's an alternative way of reading it. And I hope people, you know, that are so easily fed on, you know, on the hyper right and the right wing side of our Christianity will take a read of it.
Yeah, brother. If I might just say, you know, we have to start trying to. The Bible tells us that we should discern between the sheep and the goats, and we have to discern between not just what's biblical or unbiblical and anti-biblical, but, you know, what is right, what is wrong, what is evil, and what is good. And we have to start grudgingly and with discernment use the E word, evil, because some of this is just evil. And we have to call it that. And so maybe folk will will wake up. It's not just bad policy that children were locked in cages. It is evil.
Yes.
It's institutional evil. And then when you have someone who had no empathy, in fact, he supported it and said that there was nothing wrong with that. We're talking about the orange-haired demon again. Then that's the kind of thing you have to say, well, this is just a bridge too far.
Yeah.
This is just evil. But we don't do that.
That's right.
We're too polite. It's like, no, man, this is evil. Now I'm going to make a categorical statement. Donald Trump is an evil actor. He does no good thing for anyone, never has. He's hurt more people than most people on earth ever have. He's lied more than anybody who's ever been in the White House. It's documented, well, in the modern era anyway, but probably more than anyone else. And he's an evil actor because all he does is divide people, cause pain for his own gain. He's an agent of falsehood, and we need to start looking at him and then look at his followers and say, now this is what you are following.
Yeah.
And all right, you say, well, he's against abortion. Well, Jesus didn't say that's the main thing. But if you're going to do that, admit it. You're going to follow an evil actor.
Right.
We have to hold him accountable. That's just what
you're making the deal. Yeah, you're making the deal and saying it's worth it, and I think about back to that story when the child separation was the policy of the United States government, and it's still heartbreaking to me and so morally wrong. But to watch Jeff Sessions, then the Attorney General, come out and use the Bible, the book of Romans, to say, this is why it's justified. We're going to send a message to parents that your children will be treated like this because you cannot defy the rules and laws of this country, or you're defying God. That notion, so it wasn't just, we're going to get these religious people to sort of go along. They started using biblical arguments in public statements for why they would support child separation. Like that was part of, to me, you now have gone into an area that, first of all, that's just bad policymaking. That's just Christian nationalism at its core. And it's horrible exegesis, and it's just morally wrong. But this is the kind of thing that surrounded the Trump administration. And this is the part that's caused my blood to boil. It wasn't just Donald Trump alone. It was all the other Christians that were kind of put in these positions of power, from, Betsy DeVos at the education level, and Mike Pence as a vice president, and Mike Pompeo and Flynn. Like, these people were drawing up policies and approaches from a biblical perspective and arguing for it in a way that really demands a response like your book, which says, hey, we're not going to tolerate this. Like, this is not a legitimate argument. And if that argument's only coming from one side, we're really in trouble. So I think that's why books like yours are so helpful to us.
Yes. I think you're right, brother. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the book. Thanks for taking so much time with us today here on the podcast. It's really a gift. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, I could go on with you, brother. I enjoy talking.
Well, let's do that sometime. I get to New York a lot. Let's find a way. And if you ever find yourself stuck at the Minneapolis airport, know you've got a friend. Just
Thank you. I've been trying to avoid airports for a while the last year or so. But really, right, when you get to New York, give me a call, brother. We get together.
I'll do it. I would love to do that. Okay, I'll be there in a couple of weeks, actually. So I'll be in touch.
Okay. All the best to you, brother.
Dr. Hendricks, thank you so much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Oh, man, what a conversation. And again, thank you to Dr. Obery for coming by and spending so much time with us. Thanks to everyone in the chat. Super active chat. I can't get through all the comments, but appreciate all of you paying attention and investing in this conversation, even if you would disagree. I know this triggered some defensive reactions from some, and I would just encourage you to lean into that a little bit and ask yourself why you get so defensive when these critiques come up. I know for me, when I was kind of deconstructing the faith I was given and leaving right-wing evangelicalism, It's so easy to put up defensive walls anytime you hear a critique of your worldview. But if you just have patience and really let some of those critiques in and evaluate them for what they are, even after you get past the defensive mode, that's how we grow, that's how we change, and hopefully that's how we become more like Jesus. Because at the end of the day, for a lot of us, this isn't about right or left or being Democrat or Republican. It's about how do our politics help the most people in the way that Jesus intended. And so, as they pointed out in the interview, the thing for me was kids in cages. And if your first instinct when you hear the phrase kids in cages is to do a whataboutism, what about Obama? What about things that happened before? I would encourage you to poke that a little bit and ask yourself why you can't just face that critique. Hopefully our politics move in a direction where we hold all elected officials accountable, right or left, Democrat, Republican. And as I mentioned in the comments, there's still kids being treated poorly at the border. There's still families being separated. And Biden has continued like this stay in Mexico policy that is damaging to families and puts them in a vulnerable position. And so in our work, we're calling on the Biden administration to do better. And so maybe we can get on board and all demand better from our politicians, that we treat the most vulnerable in our world with humanity and dignity. Christians Against Christianity is the name of the book. It's by Dr. Obery Hendricks Jr. You can pick it up wherever books are sold. Thanks again for everyone in the chats. A lot of lively chats today. So thank you for sticking around. We're back tomorrow with a great conversation about Christian nonviolence. People that take Jesus' call to nonviolence seriously, what that looks like, what it doesn't look like. So that's a great conversation happening tomorrow on the Vote Common Good podcast. Thanks for being with us. Have a good one.